Joshua was, you and I would look at it, kind of the replacement that for Moses, that stellar figure of the first 5 chapters of the Bible. And with the death of Moses, God, of course, had to, humanly speaking, find a figurehead, an individual that would be the right one to step into Moses' shoes, as you and I would put at it. And of course, please remember that when God went looking for a replacement, he did not look for a miracle worker, a giant statesman of superior intellect. He was looking for a servant. And he called upon Joshua to be strong, be brave, be righteous. Okay? In chapter 2, we saw that the first thing Joshua did, of course, was to send 2 spies across the Jordan River to check out the city of Jericho, because Jericho laid at a very key juncture going into the whole western part of the promised land, as well as what would you call the military traffic areas of the north. Now, you and I sometimes think, well, I don't see the problem. All we need is a path to follow, okay? Not when you're moving somewhere between 1 3/4 and 2 million people. You need more than a goat trail to get them from point A to point B, okay? And stop and think about the supply lines you're gonna need, the logistics of keeping them fed and watered and armored and medical things taken care of, and on it goes. It's quite a logistical nightmare, it really is. So we find after the spies get home from Jericho, and if you want to look up here, I can point out, I know all of you can read this little scratchy thing from back there. Okay, down here, this is the Negev down here. Okay, you've heard of that. It's still called that. Deserty areas going off down, running down alongside the Red Sea. Kadesh Barnea in proportions clear down here. If you want to proportion the Dead Sea, this little blue spot here, about 65 miles from north to south. Okay, airline type of thing. So it'll give you a sense of perspective. It's fairly close, give or take. Sea of Galilee up here. Jordan River, of course, connecting them. God, on this time, he's got them wandering around down here in the desert for 40 years. That's where all of that happened, okay, because of their disobedience and not going in when they first came to Kadesh Barnea 40 years before. In the meantime, eventually God directs them. And you remember he's directing them how during the daytime? Pillar cloud, and at night the pillar fire, right? This is something that was distinct for all those 40 years. Manna coming down, quail being provided, God's miraculous provision, even the clothes, that they wore did not wear out. So I hope that everybody really liked what they wore when they came across the Red Sea, across the Red Sea, because that's what essentially they wore for the next 40 years. God brought them up across here, battled a couple of kings, here in what we call the Sif Jordan area, which is this area in here, and brought them up here, and they are now encamped right here at Shittim. God causes them to move right to here, okay, looking right across. You've got Gilgal. Gilgal is only 2 miles from Jericho. Gilgal was a little town in I don't know, several, 8,000-10,000. Jericho was quite a bit bigger. Jericho was the key feature place. This is the way they're going to go in. If you want it from back here, this is Gaza over here, Mount Hermon's up here, Mount Carmel over here, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim are right in here. They all play into the book of Joshua, so we'll see how all that goes as well. Somebody read the first 6 verses of chapter 3 for us, and we'll launch right into this.
Early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim and went to the Jordan, where they camped before crossing over. After 3 days, the officers went throughout the camp, giving orders to the people. When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits between you and the ark. Do not go near it. Joshua told the people, "Consecrate yourselves. Tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you." Joshua said to the priests, "Take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on ahead of the people." So they took it up and went ahead of them.
Okay, thank you, Jack. You see, Joshua is a man of action. He gets the report back from the spies, and seemingly just within 24 hours, he's got the nation moving. He moves them, in essence, he would move them from Heshbon here over to Shittim, not too far, 6-8 miles, something like that. And from this point, is my understanding, you can actually look across and see the Jericho site. You know, it was the type of land, you've got the Jordan River Valley running down through here. Don't get too carried away when you think of Jordan River in the fall. Jordan River in the fall is kind of like, I guess the mighty Weezer down here at the end of September. Don't expect too many great things as far. However, in the springtime, there is a major issue, and that's where we're at right here. Okay, March, April, Mount Hermon receives a horrendous snowfall most years, believe it or not, and you have a huge amount of inclement weather. All of that drains this way, going down through, and you wind up with flood stage 101 right during this particular time of this crossing of the Jordan. There's some interesting things that come out here. They camp there for 3 days, verse 2 tells us, and then there is the command that you need to prepare because we're going into the promised land. Now notice how there's a couple of things that is distinct here. Verse 3, when you see the Ark of the Covenant leading the way. No more pillar of fire. No more pillar of cloud. Never appears again in the history of the Bible, as far as I'm aware, except just spoken of historically. Okay, that served its purpose. You're also going to find here in a little bit that, we'll get to that, but I'll tell you to watch out for it. When they hit the promised land, no more manna. It just ceases. They're going into the promised land. Okay, so you get some interesting things that, you ready for this? Coincidentally, just happened that way, right? Fat chance of that. So he gives some instructions, and another instruction there in verses 4 and 5 is, your big buddy upstairs that you have such a wonderful time being smarmy with. That was not the relationship in the Old Testament. I hesitate to think that it's anybody's relationship even in our own period. We are talking about a totally holy, righteous being, okay, that is omni-everything. You have here a picture of, essentially, we'll just go in our things, okay, it's 2,000 cubits, just call it a half a mile, or a little more. And this was an entryway into the river. Now, you remember back from there is a lot of parallels between this crossing here and the crossing of the Red Sea 40 years before under Moses. You have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that have to get across what was a riverbed or a seabed in a very short period of time. And in both cases, not only did God miraculously provide, but they went across on dry land. Okay? Because if you think it's tough getting that many people across anyway, just take them through a bunch of mud and sink them out of sight, along with loaded wagons and livestock and everything that they were moving. So just kind of be aware of some of the things that they were dealing with through here. And he says the ark now leads the way. Okay? The ark is taking you into the promised land. The very presence of God is doing this. No more smoke, no more flame. The ark is going. Okay? So he tells them in verse 5, Joshua tells the people, sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. Okay. You know what he just said? He said to the nation of Israel, you should expect the miraculous. You know, you should expect that. They're looking for the miraculous. They're going into the promised land. They're standing, it's essentially camped there on the banks of the river at flood stage, you know, looking at 14 feet of water that's a half a mile wide. A raging torrent, just think that. And they're saying, wow. Now, you and I would go, oh, I don't know. I would imagine there's at least some of them, Joshua included, that said, or were thinking, this is going to be so cool, man. Yeah, we don't know what's going to happen, but this is going to be great. You know, I mean, because, hey, you remember what Rahab told the spies? We've been having bad dreams about you people for 40 years, ever since you blew Pharaoh out of the water, you know, came across the Red Sea on dry land and have done all the miracles like water from the rock and everything else. We're petrified. You know, we were hoping that somehow the desert would just swallow you people up sometime in the last 40 years and we wouldn't have to deal with you. Joshua's going to take them in. Keep your finger right there, and somebody, you know, and you can go over to 2 Corinthians for just a moment, because he gives the instruction, Joshua, 2 Corinthians 4, he gives the instruction to the Israelite nation, sanctify yourselves, because God is going to do wondrous work among you. Yeah, sometimes I think you and I fail to see God doing his wondrous work. We really do. Okay? And we fail to see our part in it. Somebody read 2 Corinthians 4, verse 1 for us.
Therefore, seeing we have this ministry, as we have received mercy, we faint not.
Okay? We have, not we might get, or eventually, if we go to theology seminary long enough or whatever. No, he says we have, every born again believer, because he is saved by God's mercy, does have a ministry. Okay? He is to be in service to God. If you look at the end of chapter 5, you find there that in verse 18, we have been given the ministry of reconciliation. We don't do the reconciling, only God can do that. But we have the ministry, the service of reconciliation. And then it tells us what that is in verse 19, that it basically is sharing the gospel. Verse 20 says, now then we are ambassadors for Christ. It doesn't say that you have to go to classes, you have to go to college, you need a pedigree or at least a degree or whatever. No, it doesn't, or at least a thermometer. It doesn't tell you have to have any of that. Okay? It says we are. The question is, are we going to be good ones or bad ones? Are we going to be effective or not? Well, Joshua addresses that without getting too bogged down in 2 Corinthians. He tells us to sanctify yourselves. Sanctify. Sanctify is a word that we get the word to be holy from. Greek, it's hagios. But here, the Hebrew word means just almost exact same thing. It means to set yourselves apart. And whenever it's used in relationship to God or the service of God, that's exactly what it means. Connect the dots. Set yourself apart so God can use you. Okay, and you can make the application to yourself. Joshua is telling the Israelites that they are now in a special way now. They need to recognize that they are set apart so that God can do the miraculous. Through them, for them, in front of them. Okay? All the way through you have this picture. How often do you and I fail to see the miraculous? Okay? You've got Ben and Corey's little girl in there, okay? You don't think she isn't a miracle. Every time you pick up a little baby, you are looking at a miracle that medical science simply cannot understand how it works. Oh, they can tell you all the mechanics of it, and corpuscles, and DNA, and helix, and all this other nonsense, and fingers, and toes, and noses, and, you know, but they can't understand life that is produced and comes out like that, okay? How often, you know, do you ever look at a sunflower? Sunflowers, Emily likes them, I think they're kind of ugly. But I find them fascinating because once the heads on them start to grow, we have a row of them down there, and when the sun comes up, believe it or not, even in Idaho, comes up in the east and goes around and up and over and goes down in the west, the head of that sunflower will just follow the sunlight all the way around. You don't think that isn't a miracle of design? You know? Wow. How is it that a steelhead trout that heads to the sea when they're that long, after they're born in a patch of gravel bed on some who knows where stinking little creek in the backwoods of Idaho, and will spend 3 to 5 years out in the ocean and come back like this, and come back and know within 20 to 30 feet of where he was spawned, you know, must have a heck of a GPS system. That's all I've noticed. Yeah, I mean, you know, and you don't think these things aren't miracles of design that God hasn't? This is just a couple of examples out of the natural world. My goodness sakes. You know, we're not even talking about lunar type stuff or, you know, the heavens and so forth. There's just all kinds of this stuff that we need to be aware of that is the miraculous going on around us. Oh yeah, we don't particularly have an Elijah calling down fire from heaven currently. You know, that's not to be expected, but isn't it still the same God who does the miraculous? Somebody, if you would, start there in verse 7 and read down through verse 13 for us, please. Or 7, yeah, well, I'll do 7 and 8, hang on. And the Lord said to Joshua, this day I'll begin to magnify you in the sight of all Israel, so that they may know that like I was with Moses, I'll be with you, and you will command the priests that bear the ark of the covenant, and tell them, when you have come to the brink of the water of Jordan, you shall stand still in the river. Okay? Now, here's something that God is going to do. He has named Joshua as the replacement. And now he is going to give his endorsement in a very miraculous fashion, display of the leadership authority, because Moses, you remember, was the doer of miracles. Amongst other things, the staff came out and the Red Sea parted. Okay? Joshua is going to tell the nation, hit the water, boys. You know? And the priests' feet are going to hit the water, and the Jordan is going to stop flowing. Okay? It's a lot of parallels there, aren't there? But this is God's direct, miracle-proven endorsement of the ministry of Joshua that he is dealing with here. Okay, somebody read verse 9 down through verse 13 for us.
So Joshua said to the children of Israel, come here and hear the words of the Lord your God. And Joshua said, by this you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Hivites and the Perizzites and
All the ites.
all the other rights, and
That's
the
it.
Jebusites. I volunteered for this. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is crossing over before you into the Jordan. Now therefore take for yourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 man from each tribe. And it shall come to pass, as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, that the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, and the waters that come down from upstream, and they shall stand as a heap.
Okay, thank you, Joanna.
You
Yeah,
know what I was thinking about?
there's a lot of ites there.
Yeah, when they parted the Red Sea, probably none of these people were there because all that generation had died out. They don't remember probably, except what they were told.
Well, the adult generation wouldn't have. However, if you were 18 years old when the angel of death passed through Egypt and killed the firstborn of Pharaoh and everything else, you'd have been 18 and a half when you started out on the 40 years of wandering. You're plenty old enough and to have remembered the screams of all of the deaths of the firstborn throughout Egypt. They would have gone through the Red Sea. Most of us, by the time we get to be teenagers, can comprehend a lot of what's going on. I mean, junior hires, nah, they're not even really people yet. They're kind of pre-people, I mean, they're okay, when they're little guys, they're kind of cute. When they're little and they grow a little bitter and they always want to wring their necks because they go through that really bratty stage. And then they get to the point they're almost functional for a while. And then the cork comes out and what they did have for a start of brains leaks out there for about 3 years. And their junior hires are just totally worthless. They really are.
And you don't know if they're boys or girls.
Yeah, well, yeah, we won't even talk about that.
So, Roger,
But so yeah, go ahead, Chris.
what was the age though of that generation because they were disobedient?
20,
20.
everybody 20 and up.
So anybody 20 or under 20.
Under 20, that was the point. At that
would
point,
would
yeah.
have seen.
Caleb and
Okay.
Joshua were the only two that
Right,
were
they
above
were the
20,
only
and they
two.
were probably early 20s in all honesty at the time, at least as we backdate both of them from the times of their death. But if you were any place in your teenage years up to 20 years old at the time of Kadesh Barnea, you'd have spent 40 years growing up, wandering in the Negev down there, in the desert places, watching your parents and grandparents' dead generation die off one after another, after another, after another for 40 years. But you would have come across the Red Sea. You'd have seen the waters of Egypt turn into blood. You'd have seen the plagues of locusts and darkness and everything that went with it. So there would be a firsthand experience, to give you kind of an idea that what they're going to see being done here, going across the Jordan, is the same endorsement to Joshua as God provided through Moses 40 years before. It's kind of a fun thing to look at. It truly is.
And they're a little less likely to have cold feet.
Probably so, yeah. On top of that, for 40 years, I'm sure they'd have heard a lot of campfire stories from Dad, Mom, and Grandma and Grandpa about the regrets they had because the nation wasn't obedient and went and should have gone in at Kadesh Barnea. Yeah. And that the God that did all that is the God who says, here's the promised land finally. It's right over there. See, right across that river. And I'm gonna take you there. So fun things ahead. Notice one thing in this record that Joshua provides, and that is nothing that he tells of God's conversation with him. The one thing that he leaves out is anything that has to do with himself. He does not draw attention to himself. Now, he does not say, yes, and I'm going to be the great leader and God is going to, give me all the authority and blah, blah, blah. He doesn't even mention himself. He says, this is what God is going to do. And he says he is going to lead you by the priesthood carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Okay. Now, if you have any question as far as how this works, you've got the priest carrying the ark going into the water, and notice it says the priests standing in the Jordan. Priest, plural, in the Jordan. So it's not when the first sandal of the first priest hits the water, it's when they all have their feet wet. And for what it's worth, they stand there until the entire nation crosses the Jordan River. They're the first ones in, the last ones out. Okay? kind of like first cav in Vietnam, but that's another story, right? Get the same idea, okay? So it's going to stand up in a heap. We don't have any specifics here. It names the town of Adam, believe it or not, little in the text. As far as the archaeologists know, right here where the Jabbok River winds around and comes in, it actually starts this way and flows down in. This thing is like this. Into the Jordan, there's the town of Adam, they think, right there at the junction where the Jabbok River goes into the Jordan. They feel that's probably the most likely place that the Jordan River was dammed up. Okay? There's a lot of different opinions, speculations, depending upon if you're a literalist or whether you are looking for some type of God using like an earthquake or whatever. There have been historically in the last 2,000 years a couple of different times that the Jordan River was shut off because of earthquakes. They won 1200 something, and then I think in 1920 something they had for a period of 10, 12, 14 hours or something like that. Now there's some people say, well, that's probably the way God did it. Well, he could have. On the other hand, he might not have. God can do it any way he chooses to do it. One thing I point out to you for what it's worth is you're going to see the reference to they crossed on dry land. So regardless of how God stopped and the Bible heaped up the water, as in closed the floodgates and it starts backing up for a period of time, regardless of how that actually did occur, or what means God used, God miraculously dried out the riverbed for a wide enough, long enough patch so that an entire nation could cross, complete with wagons, carts, animal herds, and you name it. So there's, I doubt if you can just say, well, it was a natural phenomenon. And if you really want to get into study of this, go back and look up Elijah and Elisha, because it tells us what, Second Kings someplace, that they crossed the Jordan on dry land, and then just a couple of days later, Elisha turned around and went back across on dry land on his own. So you really stretching coincidence if you think all this stuff can happen just it turned out that way. No, I think you have God providing the miracles as they come. Verses 14, it says, it came to pass when the people removed from their tents to pass over the Jordan, the priest bearing the ark of the covenant before all the people. They bore the ark, came to the Jordan, feet of the priest that bore the ark were dipped in the brim of the water. For very specifically, the Jordan overflowed all of his banks all the time of harvest. This is the spring harvest, you and I would call early April, probably with the snows melting on Hermon and so forth. Okay. The waters which came down from above stood and rose up as a heap very far from the city Adam. I already pointed that out to you. That is besides Zeraton, and those that came down toward the sea of the plain, the salt sea failed, were cut off. In other words, the whole system backed up. Okay? It became a giant salton sea type of thing, for we're not sure how long. Probably as much as 24 hours, maybe less. The priest bore the ark, it says in verse 17, the Lord, of the covenant of the Lord, and they stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan. Here they are standing out there with this ark on their shoulders, and they stay there for hour after hour. And it tells us that there is no familiarity with the Ark of the Covenant, with the presence of God in their midst. Half a mile was as close as they could come, and they just flowed out around the ark and went right on by. So that even made a greater miracle as far as getting them across the Red Sea. Okay, let me see. Chapter 4 takes off, and it's kind of an extensive thing. It came to pass when the people were clean passed over, the Lord spoke to Joshua and said, take you 12 men everyone out of every tribe, and command them from the midst of the Jordan, one for each tribe, pick up a stone. And the last thing out, after the people had gone, the priests are still there, they go out in the middle of Jordan, they pick up, we don't know how big the rocks are, probably reasonably good size, okay? They carried him to Gilgal. Okay, you can find out if I'm just cutting through some of the stuff. So they crossed the Jordan here, and right in front of them was Gilgal. They carried him to Gilgal. Gilgal actually means circle in whatever tribe, Girgashite or whatever it is. And so apparently they put the stones in a circle as a memorial. And, we're going to talk about that in a moment. You see, these people have prepared themselves for service. And they have been told, look for the miraculous that God is doing. You see, every time a sinner confesses Christ as Savior, the angels of heaven break into song because they rejoice. I kind of get the idea that you and I sometimes struggle with having joy over a lot of things that come into our lives. You know, rejoice evermore. We struggle with that. You know, old nature and our humanity and our selfishness. But you know, maybe if we would look for the miraculous. Again, I'm not talking about, you know, fire coming down from heaven and that kind of thing. I'm looking at the miracles that are right around us all the time. We are so used to them we don't even see them anymore. Okay, and maybe we'd have more of a thankful heart and have more joy in our lives to begin with. These stones, it tells us, as you go down through here, are going to represent, they're going to be a reminder, it says. It says in verse 3, leave them in the lodging place where you shall lodge this night, right in front of the town of Gilgal. Okay. Verse 4 said, Joshua called the 12 men that he had prepared to the children of Israel. This guy knows how to command people. He really does. Each tribe to a man. He says to them, go to take up a stone on your shoulder. I'm assuming then this isn't a pebble. This is something that is carried more readily on a shoulder, so probably a fairly notable stone. And men being what they are, you see, if Ben whips up a 40-pounder, then Tim has to put a 45-pounder up, you know, and then Jack comes by and just keels over of a heart attack. You know, he's toast anyway. But, you know, you kind of, you know, it's, so I imagine these are fairly good-sized stones that they're dealing. One for each guy, and verse 6 says, that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask, in the time to come, saying, what do these stones mean? Then you can say, this is what the Lord did. This is where the Ark of the Covenant led the way into the Promised Land. Okay? And the passage goes on and deals with this all the way down through. Turn over, if you would, or turn back in this case to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6. Because it's interesting here, the way this is phrased. It teaches you something about a particular area of educational responsibility. Okay? This is the Shema. Most of us are, somebody pick up with chapter 6, Deuteronomy, verse 4. And read down through verse 7 for us, for the sake of time. 4 through 7.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest in the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up.
Okay. Now, whose responsibility is it to teach these things to the children? It's the parents' responsibility, isn't it? It's not an educational system like we think of today with the so-called public schools or even private schools or charter schools or anything else. It's the parents' responsibility that these things are taught. Back in the book of Joshua, you find that Joshua repeats this in this particular format right here. It says, when your children ask, what's that pile of rocks doing there, Pop? You say, well, son, sit down here a minute. I'm gonna have a root beer, maybe smoke a cigar, and I'm gonna take about 20 minutes and I'm gonna tell you about the story of where those rocks came from. And it's going to re-emphasize repetitively through the generations that God did the miraculous in delivering his people and fulfilling his promises into the promised land. Okay? Just a lot of neat stuff that's going on here. So so Joshua, it tells us down through, Joshua set up the 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan where the feet of the priests had been. Now, verse 10 goes on and says, the priest that bore the ark stood in the midst of Jordan until everything was finished. The Lord commanded Joshua to speak to the people according to all that Moses had commanded, and the people hasted, passed over. That's kind of we're going to go through it, what we did, okay, a summary. It came to pass when all the people were clean passed over that the ark of the Lord passed over the priest and in the presence of the people. And this included the armed soldiers of the 2.5 tribes that had stayed over here on the Sif side of the Jordan, in this area right in here. Okay? Trans is this way. Sif, just a Hebrew term, don't worry about it. Yeah, here, there, left side, right side, yeah, one against the other, heads and tails. Same type of deal, don't get too worried about it. They passed over, notice what it says, that the Reuben, Manasseh, and Gad passed over armed before the children of Israel. In other words, they led. Okay, the ark hit the water, and the armed forces of these 2.5 tribes were the armed scouts, the tip of the spear going into the promised land. You see what's being said here? You are entering into a promised way of life that I, your God, have promised you. You'd better be prepared, and you'd better be willing to fight for it. I'm not promising you easy. I am promising you victory. Anybody see a parallel with us? Mm-hmm. Put on the whole armor of God so that you may be able to stand. Yeah. So preparation and recognizing, yeah, we are the tip of the spear. We need to recognize that. It says there was about 40,000 of them that passed over. 40,000, according to other places in Scripture, was not just almost 1/3 of the battle-ready men of those 2.5 tribes. In other words, 1 out of 3 went. Okay? And you say, well, but, well, these guys here are surrounded by enemies. Okay? Somebody has to take care of the field, somebody has to raise the crop, somebody has to defend the people. Apparently what they had was a rotating military force. Okay? These guys served for, I don't know how long, 6 months, a year, whatever, and then they rotated home and then another third came to replace them. All for predominantly for about 8 years of the direct military conquest of the promised land. It took about 8 years. Yeah, Jack.
Isn't that what they're doing today?
Yeah, you rotate troops in and out. We call it on furlough or whatever, to rest them up and send them back. Yeah, very similar type of thing. So apparently there was some kind of a rotation scheme, see? So, the Bible can teach you a lot of stuff. Verse 14 says, on that day, the Lord magnified Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him. Feared from, we've got a different word, anybody? Revered, respected, revered. They understood now, they had demonstrated to them that God was with the new guy the same way he was with Moses. Okay? And Joshua seemingly did not want to call any attention to himself. Remember the earlier passage where God had said, you need to, and Joshua relayed everything except the part about him. But here, it says the people got the point, okay? Something about actions speak louder than words. Yeah. Talk is cheap, but you get the idea, right? And they feared him as they had revered Moses all the days of his life. And God now gives Joshua instructions, command the priest to bear the ark, come up the Jordan. Joshua commanded, it came to pass, when they came out of the midst, the priest's feet were lifted, dry land. And at the end of verse 18, the waters of Jordan returned to their place and flowed over the banks as they had before. So, if you're thinking of coincidence, somehow Joshua had to have some pretty good intelligence to know when the earthquake was going to hit and when the land was going to dry, and to get across, and when the priest's feet had to hit and when the priest's feet had to leave, and get those rocks out before 3:30, because you kind of get the idea. Unless you are, I consider to be foolishly a believer in coincidence, you're going to have a hard time seeing anything except the miracle hand of God involved in all of this. Okay. The people came out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the month, camped in Gilgal at the eastern border of Jericho. Yeah, 2 miles you could see the walls of Jericho from Gilgal. And the people at Jericho, think how this would have done it. Think what, and he goes on and talks about the stones again and everything that's there. Think about fear and trepidation running rampant through the streets of Jericho that night. They've been sitting out there and say, what's going on? Yeah, I see those people, but thankfully they can't get across the river because it's at flood stage. And they say, but they're coming across. The water seemed to just be backing up. Here they come. But the mud's 6 feet deep. Then they're just rolling right through there, man. It's just like Ron out running the disc right now. The dust is just a-boiling out the back. It's, man, the wagon, whoa, what a deal, huh? Yeah. And they're thinking, that sounds suspiciously like a miracle. And they run a couple of, the young testosterone bulky guys fast on. They got their Nikes on and they zoom them down there, and they're looking around and seeing what's going on. There's 2 million people come across the dry riverbed and the water stacked up, and they see all this, and then the water come in. They zoom on back, and when they get to Jericho, they go out and they say, we got a problem, folks. The God who did all this miraculous stuff 40 years ago, getting these people out of Egypt, he's back at it. He's doing it again. Yeah, the river, just like the Red Sea. Where? You get the idea of what's going on there. Okay? They dried it all up. The purpose? Verse 24, that all the people of the earth might know the hand of the Lord that is mighty, and that you might fear the Lord your God forever. Now, yes, Jack.
Another miracle that you don't see is that water that was all backed up. It would be, if it came all at once, normally it would be like a dam breaking.
Yeah, exactly.
And it would flow everywhere.
But it doesn't say that, does it? It just says it came back to being normal springtime flood, but it doesn't say that it overspread for miles in all directions. Yeah, good observation.
I'm gonna bet it didn't move those rocks either.
I doubt it, yeah. In fact, I would suspect that if you knew right where to look, those rocks might still be there, but I don't know for sure. But you guys can go look for them. Let me know how that works out for you. Now, bear with me for just a few minutes, because I want to this is important to kind of lead into what we're going to cover the next time. In chapter 5, it says, it came to pass when the kings of the Amorites, which were on the side of the Jordan westward, that's where Jericho is, and all the kings of the Canaanites, remember all those ites that Joanna read here just a little while ago, which were clear over to by the sea, a whole bunch of them out here, okay, there's a ton of them that we're talking about, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of Jordan from in front of the children of Israel, that their heart melted Yeah, too scared to spit. You know, that's a polite way to put it. Okay. Their heart melted. There was no spirit left in them because they just, wow, we are in serious dog do. Can I say that? Yeah, okay.
You did.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, I got Jack's approval. So it's so there's a couple of things that we need to recognize when we talk about being preparation for ministry. God is preparing these people. He spent 40 years of wilderness preparing them. And now he's done the miraculous of taking them across the Jordan River at flood stage, but they're still not quite ready to really get into the conquest of the promised land. So before they head for Jericho, that very first night that they get there, God said, you got to circumcise 40 years of kids. You know, you get this circumcision thing, of course, goes back to the Abrahamic covenant. Remember what the Abrahamic covenant was all about in Genesis 17? This is 500 years before Joshua's time. God had promised Abram, I'm going to give you a land. It's going to be from here to here. Basically, it goes from here to here and from here to here. Okay, much larger than my piece of cardboard shows you. In reality, but he says that's going to be the promised land because I made a promise to your offspring that would be your land forever. Okay? And that's why the Jews refuse to give it up, because they know that it is what the Yahweh God had promised them clear back to Father Abraham. Remember what the token of that covenant agreement was: circumcision of all the male children, which Abraham and that generation went through. Kind of interesting that in the centuries that followed, and apparently during the Egyptian time, now you got all the way to the Passover feast coming out of Egypt. There was a circumcision that went on there, but you have no mention of it again until here. Apparently, you had 40 years of circumcision not being practiced because you've got a whole nation of men that undergo this. By the way, from a tactical perspective, this is not a good time to circumcise a bunch of men. If you want them to go into battle, you know, against a reinforced enemy inside of city walls, you know, but this is what God says needs to be done, and Joshua doesn't even hesitate. He says, sharpen the knives, let the priests go at it, and we'll get all this done. And I'm assuming probably the priests were all involved in that as well. And says, this is the cause, verse 4, that all the people that came out of Egypt, all the males, men of war, because all of them had died in the way, and all of the people since then, all the male children had not been circumcised. So all those 40 years of wilderness wanderings, nothing that went on during that time. Okay? Verse 6 says, the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness till all the people that were men of war which came out of Egypt were consumed, because they obeyed not the voice of the Lord. There seems to be a real relationship between obedience and being able to minister. Being able to serve God effectively and obedience with no stretch of the imagination, go hand in glove. You simply cannot be effective in the service of God if we're disobedient to the commands of God. It just doesn't work that way. Okay? It's going to be a direct hindrance. All the children who've been raised up in verse 7 that were uncircumcised had to be circumcised. Okay? And verse 9 says, the Lord said to Joshua, this day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from off you. Wherefore the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day. Again, Gilgal means circular. Now there's been suggestions that because circumcising the foreskin is a circular process. Perhaps that was something to do with it. There's a lot of speculation. Not sure if there's any real nailed it down type of thing. So that was one additional issue. Okay. Final thing, this the next couple of verses. The children of Israel encamped in Gilgal kept the Passover on the 14th day. Wow! An amazing coincidence. Another one. You just can't hardly, you're just amazed at the amazingness of the amazing coincidences that amazingly came about just because it happened that way. Right? Guess when the last major Passover had been observed? Coming out of Egypt. All kinds of parallels that would not have been wasted on the children of Israel. They would have been understanding of this. So they celebrated this. Verse 12 says, the manna ceased the day after they had eaten of the old corn of the land. And there was no more manna, but they ate of the fruit of Canaan that year. God had made a promise. Remember Joshua and Caleb? They were the two of the obedient spies that come back 40 years before with a huge bundle of grapes and said, man, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. And the 10 guys said, well, but there's giants in the land, we're like grasshoppers. And Joshua said, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. No problem. If God's on our side, we can't be beaten. So they held a good democratic vote, 10-2, and spent 40 years dying in the wilderness instead of doing what was right, which goes to show you the majority isn't always right. Okay? And you need to continue to stand for righteousness. A lot of fun stuff. At this point, not at the beginning of chapter 6, but at this point, you should have a great big honking subtitle in your study Bible, because now you directly go to the military conquest of the land, which is the main thing for the next 10 chapters or so. What I find fun is there's so much in addition to just the military stuff that you find in the next 10 chapters, which just goes to show you that God knows how to do war in righteousness, just like he knows how to do everything else. So let's close in prayer, and if you got some questions, we'll go from there. Father, thank you for this text that has been before us this evening, dealing with you providing miraculously the fulfillment of your promise to bring the people to a land that would be flowing with milk and honey. Goes clear back, century upon century, to the promise to Abraham before there were ever even any children born that would inherit those promises that you had given to him, that there would be a land and that they would have it for their own forever because you had given it to them as the land of promise. So here it is, going into the promised land. There are battles yet to be fought. The armies needs to have sharp swords, but they need to fight on the side of righteousness and do it God's way, as we'll see that unfold in the weeks ahead. In Christ's name, amen.